At first glance, Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists look like two completely unrelated religions. One rejects the Trinity, the other teaches it. One is directed by a governing body in New York. The other has no living prophet guiding it today. One is known around the world for knocking on doors. The other is known for hospitals, universities, and Saturday worship. They disagree about the nature of God, the soul, and the identity of Jesus. And yet, when you set aside those differences and look strictly at what each group teaches about the end of the world, something unexpected appears. Underneath the theological clashes are 5 striking similarities, patterns of thinking that show up in both movements, again and again, in almost the exact same shape. The final one changes everything you thought you knew about where these movements actually came from. It's the reason historians of American religion often study these two groups in the exact same chapter. Let's break down the countdown. Similarity. 5. Both teach that we are currently living in the final phase of human history. Most religions treat the end of the world as a distant idea, a concept to be believed in, not something to be watched for. For Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists, the end isn't a theory, it's a running countdown. For Jehovah's Witnesses, the turning point was 1914. Watchtower teaching claims this year marked the moment Christ began ruling invisibly in heaven, plunging the world into the last days. Wars, famines, and moral decline are all presented as hard evidence that the clock is running out. Seventh-day Adventists arrive at a similar conclusion through a different route. Their theology points to 1844 as the beginning of Christ's investigative judgment in heaven. From that point forward, history entered its closing chapter. Different dates, different reasoning. But the emotional conclusion is identical. We are the generation living just before the end. This single conviction dictates how members spend their time, view their careers, and plan their families. Different timelines, same intense urgency. Similarity. 4. Both build their end times theology on the exact same 2 books of the Bible. Out of 66 books, both movements draw their prophetic identity primarily from Daniel and Revelation, and often the very same chapters. Take Daniel chapter 2. A Babylonian king dreams of a massive statue made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay, eventually shattered by a stone. Both movements read this not as symbolism to be admired from a distance, but as a literal, historical map. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and the divided kingdoms, ending with God's kingdom arriving at the end of the sequence. They both hyper-focus on Daniel 7's beasts, Daniel 8's timeline of 2,300 days, and Revelation 13's mark of the beast. Where they diverge is what the map actually shows. Adventists read Daniel 8 as pointing to 1844. Jehovah's Witnesses calculate Daniel 4 to point to 1914. Adventists connect the mark of the beast to a future Sunday worship law. Witnesses link it to a mark of allegiance to human political systems. Same texts, different conclusions. But the underlying investigative method is identical. Take prophetic symbols, assign them to historical events, and calculate forward. This method, called Historicism, used to be the mainstream Protestant way of reading prophecy centuries ago. The Reformers used it. But in the 20th century, most of the Christian world quietly abandoned it for futurism. These two movements didn't. They are survivors of an abandoned way of reading Scripture. Similarity. 3. Both teach that God has a distinct, identifiable people in the last days. As history approaches its climax, neither movement believes God works through Christianity in general. He works through a highly specific group of people who understand what everyone else has missed. Jehovah's Witnesses describe this as God's organization, directed by the faithful and discreet slave, identified as the governing body. Seventh-day Adventists use different language. They call it the Remnant Church, those who keep the commandments and carry a final message to the world before the end. While Adventists generally don't teach that salvation strictly requires membership in their denomination. An important distinction, the structural pattern is the exact same. God has a specially identified people, entrusted with an exclusive mission. This creates a powerful sense of purpose and belonging, but it also draws a hard line between those inside the mission and everyone outside of it. Similarity 2. Both expect a coming global test of loyalty. This is where the psychological similarities become impossible to ignore. In Jehovah's Witness teaching, history ends at Armageddon. But right before that, governments will turn against religion. Loyalty to Jehovah will be tested publicly and personally. Neutrality stops being a preference and becomes a line that cannot be crossed. For Seventh-day Adventists, history ends with a final crisis centered on a Sunday law. Governments will enforce a day of worship. Those who comply receive the mark of the beast. Those who refuse are sealed by God. Different villains, different mechanisms. But look at the architecture of the story. The crisis is worldwide. Governments are the enforcers. The test isn't about private belief. It's about visible, public obedience. And in both scenarios, a small faithful minority stands firm while the entire world turns against them. If you believe a test like that is imminent, you spend your life rehearsing for it. You wonder if you'll lose your job, if your family will turn you in, if you'll fold under the pressure. Millions of people in both groups grow up imagining this exact terrifying scenario. Two different theological languages, building the exact same mental architecture. So, how did two movements this drastically different end up telling the very same story? Similarity. 1. Both grew out of the exact same prophetic movement. In the 1830s, a Baptist farmer in New York named William Miller became convinced that the prophecies of Daniel could be decoded into a precise date. Applying the day-for-a-year principle to Daniel 8, he calculated that Christ would return between the spring of 1843 and 1844. The message spread like wildfire. Tens of thousands of Americans believed him. But the first window passed. So, a revised date was set, October 22, 1844. Expectation reached a fever pitch. People sold their land. Farmers left their crops standing in the fields. Debts were settled. They waited. The sun set. Midnight passed. And the next morning, everything was exactly the same. It became known as the Great Disappointment. The movement shattered, but it didn't vanish. One group concluded the math was right, but the event was misunderstood. Christ hadn't returned to earth. He had entered a new phase of ministry in the heavenly sanctuary. This group, embracing the Sabbath and the writings of Ellen G. White, ultimately became the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Another faction kept Miller's investigative method, but reworked the numbers. Nelson Barber was one of them. In the 1870s, he crossed paths with a young businessman named Charles Taze Russell. They published new date-based expectations together. Russell eventually broke away, but he took the calculation methods with him. Decades later, that same inherited math was reworked to produce the year that defines the Watchtower today, 1914. Let's be precise here. Adventists didn't found the Watchtower. Russell was never a Millerite. He was born 8 years after the Great Disappointment. But he inherited the machinery, the historicist reading, the day-for-a-year principle, the absolute conviction that the Bible was a puzzle that could be resolved into dates. They are not parent and child. They are closer to siblings, raised in the same house, growing out of the exact same 19th century soil of American prophetic expectation. That shared DNA explains everything we've looked at today. The historical map, the specific years, the faithful remnant, the global test of loyalty. These aren't coincidences. They are inherited traits. There is a verse both of these movements quote often. In Matthew 24, the disciples ask Jesus for the sign of his coming and the end of the age. He gives them signs, wars, famines, persecution, and tells them to watch. But in the exact same conversation, he says something else. No one knows the day or the hour. Not the angels, not the Son, only the Father. Watch, but don't calculate. The story of these two movements proves how difficult it is to hold both halves of that command at once. William Miller wasn't a fraud. He was a sincere man who took his math seriously enough to be publicly humiliated for it. But sincerity doesn't protect a flawed method. Both movements inherited the idea that prophecy is a solvable equation, that if you chart carefully enough, the future becomes readable. The 19th century tried to solve the equation. The equation didn't solve, yet the method outlived the failure. Both movements kept the chart and simply revised the dates. That is the true inheritance of 1844. Not a prediction, but a way of reading. And a way of reading can be passed down for generations after the original prediction has been quietly swept away. If you grew up in either tradition, you already know what that feels like from the inside. The certainty, the urgency, the illusion that you possessed a secret the rest of the world was blind to. Perhaps the honest question isn't which of these movements got the timeline right. Maybe it's whether the timeline was ever the point at all. Jesus told his disciples to keep watch, not so they could name the day, but so that whenever it came, they wouldn't be found asleep. If you came out of either tradition, what finally made you question the chart? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.